So now you have in mind a picture of what's happening at the level of individual hairs. And if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking, wow, there's a lot going on down there, just below the surface of the skin. And indeed there is. But really the things to think about are that stem cell population that actually give rise to the hair proteins, so that actually create the hair, the melanocytes that darken that hair, that give it pigment, that sebaceous gland and the oil sebum that provides some important antimicrobial and other properties to that general region, and that erector pili muscle. That erector pili muscle, as I mentioned earlier, is important for creating goosebumps, and it's important for keeping huskies warm in cold environments, but it's doing some other really important things as well, and we'll talk about those as time goes on in this episode. Right now, what I want to do is just talk for a moment about how hairs actually grow and why they grow the way they do. This is extremely important toward understanding hair replacement and slowing hair loss. There are three basic phases of growth of a hair. The first phase is the phase in which the stem cells down in that bulb give rise to the cells that make up the proteins of the hair. So the actual growth of the hair. And keep in mind that the hair is actually growing from the bottom up. You might think, of course it's growing from the bottom up. Everyone knows that. But a lot of people think that the hair starts growing right at the surface of the skin. That's not the way it works. The hair is actually growing from deep within the root and stacking up and then eventually extends out across the top of the skin. That growth phase is called the anagen phase, A-N-A-G-E-N. And this, for some people, will ring a bell because if you've ever been interested in weightlifting, or even if you're an endurance runner, you'll hear about things that are anabolic, that promote growth, so ana, of growth, or catabolic, that promote breakdown. So the first phase of hair growth is called the anagen phase, and it's a period of varying duration depending on which hair in the body we're talking about. So the anagen, or the growth phase for hairs on the head, as I mentioned earlier, is anywhere from 2 to 8 years. For most people, it's going to be about 6 years. What this means is that if we were to just not cut our hair, just let our hair grow for 2 to 8 years, that hair would eventually grow to a length that it was at its maximum and then would stop growing. So we can say that the anagen phase of hairs on the scalp is 2 to 8 years, right? The duration of the growth phase. Contrast that, for instance, with the duration of the anagen phase for hairs of the eyebrows. The hairs of the eyebrows grow about 4.2 millimeters per month. Believe it or not, people have measured this sort of thing. Now that's an average, so some people are going to have eyebrows that grow much longer per month. I'm somebody who, for instance, has mostly the same length eyebrow hairs, but every once in a while I get one of those eyebrow hairs that really seems to be heading off my head. It really wants out of there. And so it's much longer than the rest. What does that mean? Does it mean that it grew faster? Maybe, but chances are the stem cell population in that particular eyebrow follicle for that one eyebrow hair is longer than it is for the others. This is really important. I'm trying to illustrate two principles at once here. The first principle is that different hairs on your body, including the hairs on your scalp, have a growth phase of different duration. This is why the hairs on your head can grow very, very long, because they have a very long anagen or growth phase, and the hairs on your eyebrows will only grow for a few months before they actually fall out and then have to undergo replication of the stem cells to give you new eyebrow hair to then grow. What's important here is not just that there are differences in the duration of the growth phase, but rather that the rate of hair growth is not something that tends to differ within a given body region, right? You'll hear people say, oh, my hair grows really, really fast. Other people will say, oh, my hair grows really, really slowly. That is probably not the case. While there could be slight differences in the rate of growth, that is the addition of more keratin to the actual hairs, so creation of more hair more quickly, almost certainly what's happening is that the duration of the anagen phase in some people is just much longer than it is in other people. And we don't realize this, and we tend to think more in terms of how fast hair grows, because if you were to just look at somebody's hair, you'd say, oh, they're all more or less the same length. I mean, some people's bangs are shorter than the back because they cut them, but if they were to just grow their hair, you'd say, oh, it's all more or less the same length. But if we were to zoom in with a microscope, we would see that there are a lot of hairs down there in between the other hairs that are very, very short or even tiny, tiny, tiny. And those are coming in as the other ones are finishing their anagen phase, okay? So that's the anagen or growth phase. After the anagen phase comes the catagen phase. Again, this resembles the word catabolic or the breakdown phase. During the catagen phase, the hair is actually receding not from the top down to the skin surface and then into the root, but the other way. It's actually receding from that bulb region up toward the surface. And that catagen phase is going to also be of different duration depending on which area of the body you're in, and it will vary a little bit depending on who you are, meaning from person to person. We'll talk about the influences on the anagen and catagen phase in a moment. Why is it important that it actually recedes from the inside out? Well, that's important because as it does that, there's actually a change in that bulb region down below, because normally there's an interface, there's a conversation that's occurring between the stem cell population, the melanocytes, and the hair itself, and they support each other. And remember, there's blood vessels going into that area, or rather capillaries that are feeding that area as well. After the catagen phase comes the telogen phase, which means rest. The telogen phase is a period in which no new hair proteins are being added by those stem cells. And during that telogen phase, that bulb down there at the bottom, instead of being nice and oval and really having a lot of space in it with all these different things like stem cells, starts to pinch off from the little tube that comes down from the surface of the skin that normally would have a hair in it. It starts to pinch off, and at some point, many hair follicles pinch off that bulb region, and it recedes and dies. And when it recedes and dies, the stem cell population and the melanocytes go with it. In other words, there is no longer a population of stem cells to give rise to more hair after that telogen phase. And there's no longer melanocytes to pigment the hair, and in fact, the hair isn't there anymore, so there's no hair even to pigment after that telogen phase, unless it's a hair of a particular type, such as the hair on your scalp, which can then re-enter the cell cycle and get back into an anagen phase and regrow more hair from stem cells. Okay, so there are 3 critical stages of the life cycle of a hair that are relevant to today's conversation. There's the anagen phase, during which the hair grows. There's the catagen phase, during which the hair actually starts to recede and die. Right? The protein is actually disappearing from the bottom up. And then we have the telogen phase, which is the phase in which the stem cell population is what's called semi-quiescent, semi-quiet, or completely quiescent, where it's not active at all. Those 3 phases make up the life cycle of a hair, keeping in mind that for some hairs, they can re-enter the life cycle and go back into the anagen phase if there's stem cells there, and if there's oxygen there, and if there is sufficient blood support, and this is a very important and, if there are the appropriate hormonal signals to support growth, and there is a reduction or an absence in the hormone signals that actually trigger that telogen phase. I make this point now because much of the rest of today's discussion is going to focus on why particular hormones, such as dihydrotestosterone, cause hair loss, and why inhibiting things like dihydrotestosterone can support the preservation of hair that you have and the regrowth of hair. To make a long story very short, and then we'll get into some additional details that are relevant and that I hope you'll stick around to listen to. Dihydrotestosterone, which is a derivative of testosterone, causes changes in that bulb region where the stem cells reside. It shortens or halts the anagen phase of hair growth, and it extends and promotes the catagen and telogen phase. So when we hear that, dihydrotestosterone makes your hair fall out, or estrogen makes your hair grow, there are real chemical, or we should say biochemical, legitimate reasons as to why that is, but it all comes back to this 3 phases of hair growth: the anagen growth phase, the catagen catabolic or hair loss phase, and the telogen phase, which is a rest period in which the hairs can either come back if it re-enters the anagen phase, or maybe it's over for good. Hormones are the accelerator and the brake on each one of those phases.